Hello, everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Dalia Gebrial, and I will be joined later today by James Meadway. But coming up on tonight's show, the markets threaten Labour's economic plans, Trump's counterterrorism chief wades into the Shamima Begum row, and Mick Lynch announces his retirement. So stay tuned for all of that. Some of the most destructive wildfires Los Angeles has ever seen are currently blazing across the city and its surroundings. At least 5 fires are burning across the city's neighborhoods, from the wealthy coastal Palisades and Hollywood itself to the borders of the Los Angeles National Forest. In the Palisades, where the median house value is $4.5 million, the luxury homes of the rich and famous have come under threat from the wildfires, with some burning to the ground. That fire has so far spread over an area of more than 17,000 acres, with over 1,000 structures burned down. It's a similar story in the Hollywood Hills, where compulsory evacuation orders are now in place. Homes there have burned down too, with the flames prompting chaotic evacuations. In total, 130,000 residents have been evacuated, and so far 5 people have died in the flames. Now, many of those evacuated as a result of the fire are just ordinary people whose every possession is at risk right now. Some are staying in temporary evacuation centres dotted around the city, whilst others have relocated to be with friends and family in safer areas. Some of the evacuees spoke to Reuters.
It was out in the backyard hosing things down because the embers were really going crazy. And then finally, the sky was just bright orange. And I go, we got to go now. And I think went at the right time. Because all of a sudden you see, like a tree starting to burn. The embers were horrible. They were the ones who were starting fires in the houses.
There were houses to the back of us, to the side of us, and to the street below, and that's where the problem came. The wind whipped up, the flames were up about 30, 40 feet high, and you hear pop, 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 sound like a war zone. In fact, there were 2 big explosions that actually shook the ground. And so I knew it was time to get out. There's time to be, brave, and there's a time to use some common sense, and common sense told me it's time to go.
What was interesting for me was the realization as I was choosing things, the things that I didn't choose. And it wasn't, sometimes you'd look at something, you go, you know what, I've had that for almost all my life, but you know what, I can let that go. I can let it go. I can let it go. And then I took photographs and things that meant something, a little figurine that my daddy bought for me when I was 5, or those kinds of things. So that was the kind of stuff I was thinking about, and the realizations that I had when I was going through that.
Those are the kinds of stories you hear whenever people are forced to evacuate in the wake of catastrophe. But unlike in the case of most natural disasters, some of those affected by the Los Angeles fires are very, very rich. And it shows not only in the way they cope with the disaster, but also the ways in which they choose to try to insulate themselves from it. The New York Times reports that luxury hotels like the Sunset Tower Hotel and the Beverly Hills Hotel are now booked to capacity, with well-heeled industry bigwigs filling up their rooms. And the demand for hotel rooms is so great that a California tourist board sent out a reminder that hotels are only allowed to surge their pricing by 10% when a local or state emergency has been declared. So please remember to only increase your profits by 10% during a life-threatening emergency. Thanks so much for that. And some of Los Angeles' richest residents are even trying to jump the queue when it comes to firefighters. Real estate mogul Keith Wasserman posted this on Twitter. Does anyone have access to private firefighters to protect our home in Pacific Palisades? Need to act fast here. All neighbors' houses burning. Will pay any amount. Thank you. Will pay any amount. Feels like if we keep going the way we're going, that's going to be the mantra of the rich during climate breakdown. After an understandable backlash, Wasserman deleted his account. But the use of private firefighters in Hollywood is nothing new. Some of you might remember that in 2018, Kim Kardashian and Kanye West came clean about their use of concierge firefighters, with many of their neighbors preferring to stay quiet about their own private protection. And just last month, the Daily Mail reported this. Wealthy California residents have begun installing private fire hydrants as a new symbol of wealth. Celebrities have also been praising regular fire brigade services for saving their homes. This was actor Chris Pratt on Instagram. He said, "Please send prayers and strength tonight to everyone in Los Angeles affected by these devastating fires. Los Angeles is in a state of emergency and over 30,000 have been ordered to evacuate. Thank you to the brave firefighters and first responders who are working tirelessly to protect lives, homes, and wildlife as they battle fast-moving wildfire fueled by fierce winds. You are true heroes, and we are endlessly grateful for your sacrifice and courage." Now, that's a nice message, one I'm sure that we all share. But I wonder if Pratt knows that many of those firefighters are not there entirely out of their own choice. According to Forbes magazine, 30% of the Los Angeles fires are being fought by prison inmates who have no choice but to tackle the blazes thanks to a slavery clause in the Constitution. The Forbes piece goes on to say this: "While the 13th Amendment ended slavery in the United States, a loophole allows people convicted of crimes to be forced to work for public or private enterprises. In this case, those tasked with firefighting volunteer for these positions and must meet certain criteria. They are not assigned without their consent. Their pay scale, however, was doubled in 2023, and depending on the skill level and task assigned, they either received 16 cents to 74 cents an hour or a maximum day rate of $5.80 to $10.24. So for those prison inmate firefighters, most of their lunches consist of a simple sandwich, 2 pieces of white bread with a few slices of bologna plus an apple. Their daily food budget of approximately $4 per day is hardly enough to sustain them for their high volume of manual labor. But even indentured labor, private water, and concierge firefighters haven't been enough to protect the super wealthy from the flames, with several celebrities and moguls having lost their homes too. And according to insurance forecaster AccuWeather, the economic costs of the fire would reach up to $57 billion. So what's behind the blaze? The fires have been spread by the Santa Ana wind, which has been blowing at 80 miles per hour and hitting 100 miles per hour in some areas. These are strong, dry gusts that blow in from the USA's western desert interior into Southern California, pushing dry, hot air towards the coast. That in turn drops humidity, drying out the already brittle vegetation and inflaming fires once they begin. But climate change has played a role too. California was in a decades-long drought until just 2 years ago, and rising temperatures are drying out vegetation faster than ever. The Guardian reports this: "Fires in the US West are becoming more frequent and larger, scientists have found, with the climate emergency, raising the risk of fast-moving fires by around 25% in California. 10 of the largest California wildfires have occurred in the last 2 decades, with 5 of these fires occurring in 2020 alone. Researchers have calculated that the human-caused climate emergency has contributed to a 172% increase in California's burned areas since the 1970s, with a further spread expected in the decades ahead." So basically, it's as bad as it's gotten now, it's going to get worse. Politicians, however, are blaming everything except man-made climate change for the out-of-control fires. The size and spread of the fires has left California struggling to meet the water and manpower demands of controlling the blaze. And speaking to journalists, Donald Trump had this explanation for that water shortage.
Well, it's very sad because I've been trying to get Gavin Newsom to allow water to come. You'd have tremendous water up there. They send it out to the Pacific because they're trying to protect a tiny little fish, which is in other areas, by the way, called a smelt. And for the sake of a smelt, they have no water. They had no water in the fire hydrants today in Los Angeles. It was a terrible thing. And we're going to get that done. It's going to finally be done. I got it done from the federal side, and he didn't want to sign it, but it's not going to happen again like that. There's no reason. Can you imagine? You have farmers that don't have any water in California. They have plenty of water. They don't have a drought. They send it out to the Pacific, and it's crazy.
So that was a reference to California Governor Gavin Newsom. But California's water security director says Trump has his facts completely wrong, telling the LAist this: Tying Bay Delta management into devastating wildfires that have cost people's lives and homes is nothing short of irresponsible, and it's happening at a time when the Metropolitan Water District has the most water stored in its system in the history of the agency. It's not a matter of enough water coming from Northern California to put out a fire. It's about the continued devastating impacts of a changing climate. Responding to Trump, Gavin Newsom said this.
I hate to even ask this question, but the president-elect chose to attack you, blame you for this.
One can't even respond to it. I mean, people are literally fleeing. People have lost their lives. Kids lost their schools. Families completely torn asunder. Churches burned down. This guy wanted to politicize it. I have a lot of thoughts, and I know what I want to say. I won't. I stood next to a president of the United States of America today, and I was proud to be with Joe Biden. And he had the backs of every single person in this community. He didn't play politics, didn't try to divide any of us.
Also taking some of the blame for the disaster is Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass. She reportedly left the city to join a diplomatic mission in Ghana just as wind and fire warnings were increasing, only to return to a city in flames. Bass is also reportedly responsible for slashing the city's fire brigade budget by nearly $20 million, probably made easier by the fact that you have prison inmates fighting these fires for less than $1 an hour. Sky News caught up with Bass, and this attempted interview makes for some pretty uncomfortable viewing.
Do you owe citizens an apology for being absent while their homes were burning? Do you regret cutting the fire department budget by millions of dollars, Madam Mayor? Have you nothing to say today? Have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today? Elon Musk says that you're utterly incompetent. Are you considering your position? Madam Mayor, have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today who are dealing with this disaster? No apology for them? Do you think you should have been visiting Ghana while this was unfolding back home?
You know, you'd think on that several hours long flight from Ghana, she would have thought of a simple, it's terrible, we're doing everything we can, my hearts are with the people. You don't even have to say anything specific, but you would think that, on that flight back, she would have had some time to cook up some kind of response rather than just looking like her soul had vacated her body. But another thing that I want to mention in that clip that really frustrated me, obviously we can say that the mayor was incompetent, whatever. I'm much more angry with the fact that she's slashing public services rather than, having a bad interview. But the interviewer saying, Elon Musk said this about you. Why is the political media class reinforcing this idea that Elon Musk, who's unelected, who, has bought himself influence by buying Twitter, why is he becoming the consecrator of the careers of elected officials? Why is what Elon Musk says something that people are having to answer to in Sky News, outlets? Of all of the things that you needed to ask her at that moment, saying, what do you think of what Elon Musk tweeted about you? It's just making the problem worse. But someone who we do want to know what he thinks about what Karen Bass should be doing and how we should be tackling this issue of climate breakdown, and someone who's actually qualified to speak on this issue. It is economist hottie and host of the Macrodose podcast, James Meadway. James, what do you make of, your podcast obviously deals a lot with the economics of climate breakdown. What do you feel, both looking at how these wildfires are devastating California, but also the very all over the place political response that we're seeing from all sides of the political spectrum?
Yeah, thanks for that. There's a couple of things really. I mean, one is that I think this chaotic response is probably going to worsen from this point onwards. Partly it's that a whole bunch of people in positions of authority like Donald Trump have got themselves to a point where they can't really talk about climate change being in any way responsible for any of this. I mean, what we're finding is that the science now of attribution studies, as it's called, is enabling us to pin down with some precision just how much climate change is impacting on any specific extreme weather event. So we can say with some certainty that these wildfires that we're seeing, it's probably obvious to a lot of people watching, but we can say with some scientific validity that it's climate change causing and worsening these things. In the case of the Los Angeles, California fires, it's very dry conditions over a long period of time, followed by what was a very dry winter, combined with what appears to be increasing prevalence of high velocity winds, which spread the fire very rapidly. That's also combined with, by the way, and somebody like the great Marxist geographer Mike Davies wrote a huge amount about the geographical setting of Los Angeles and California itself being susceptible, more susceptible from the way that we've encroached on nature and the way that development has happened there, is more susceptible, more vulnerable to wildfires than we would wish, because of the way it's designed and it's been built over many, many years. So you have this combination of problems that have now stacked up in the state for a long period of time. And it's not just the immediate impacts, the bit that sometimes we kind of forget about.
Because once the fires are out and the situation is brought under control from the immediate crisis, it's the longer term effects of this can be devastating as well. There was a study last year that found there'd been 50,000 excess deaths in California over the last decade from smoke inhalation from wildfires. So the wildfire itself is terrifying and deadly in some tragic cases. But the larger impact of this is when the smoke drifts through the air, people breathe it in, and particularly if you are already susceptible to various sort of breathing conditions, this can actually add up to a long-term detrimental, even fatal impact for a whole bunch of people. And obviously those impacts, again, tend to concentrate in poorer districts, in poorer households, or those who have less ready access to healthcare, which is a colossal, obviously catastrophic problem in the US in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of people's living conditions. And that's 50,000 excess deaths from what's taking place here. So it's a long-term impact that also starts to play out. The final part of this, I suppose, is what happens when you start to not just have the costs in the raw sort of human terms of the fire, but the actual economic costs of these things. That California is one of the states in the US where increasing numbers of people find themselves unable to afford insurance, because insurance companies are supposed to pay out when disasters happen, say, well, we can't afford to profitably carry on paying people out, so we won't do that, so we won't give you the insurance, or it just becomes too expensive to get. And so more and more people have to go to the insurer of last resort, this state fund that is expensive and not particularly well supplied and not particularly reliable. That now has huge liabilities, $458 billion in total, in addition to what the private insurance company is supposed to be paying out. There's a real risk from all of this that because you have private insurers that may not be able to pay out, that can't afford to pay out as much as the 20 or more, 50 billion in some cases, dollars at potential damage being done here and potentially rising upwards. I mean, we're looking at the most expensive wildfires in California's history. They can't pay out. The state has huge liabilities that it can't meet. You're suddenly looking at what can turn into what gets called by economists a climate Minsky moment. In other words, you have the initial shock of this extreme weather event that then cascades into the financial system and sets off a wider financial crisis. So there's any number of serious sort of immediate impacts that start to play out of this, all of which have exactly that class dimension you were talking about. That if you're rich, you can insulate yourself from a great deal of this stuff. Everybody else, not so lucky.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that longtime climate organizer Asad Raymond said, where he said, yes, we might all be on the Titanic might be sinking, we might all be on it, but some of us are listening to the orchestra on the top deck and some of us are, scrambling for life jackets on the bottom deck. We're not all in this together in the same way. And when it comes to the after effects of this, I mean, we're seeing the devastation of people's homes burning down. That's just the tip of the iceberg, so to say. I mean, I dread to think agriculturally what the scale of these wildfires would mean. California is a place that is agriculturally really important, and that has knock-on effects on the food systems globally. So it's not just about what's happening to people in LA, but this kind of stuff really has the impacts of climate change do not respect national borders in the way that humans do. There are fresh signs of economic woe on the horizon for the UK as the markets appear to be showing a drop in their confidence in the British economy. They're not the only ones. And some are arguing that the latest developments will leave Chancellor Rachel Reeves' spending plans in tatters. So, what exactly has happened? Well, things began to look gloomy earlier this week. That's when the interest rate offered on 30-year government bonds rose to the highest level since 1998. That same thing happened to 10-year bonds today. They hit their highest level since the 2008 financial crisis. So, bonds are the mechanism by which the government borrows money by promising investors a fixed return over a fixed period. So, when the interest rate on bonds, also known as the yield, goes up, it means that the government has to pay more money to service its debts. At the moment, Britain pays more than £100 billion a year in interest, which is almost as much as the deficit. But the problem now for Reeves is that her spending plans announced in the autumn were dependent both on £40 billion in tax rises as well as £9.9 billion raised through borrowing via a tweak in her fiscal rules. So the rise in borrowing costs may now cut significantly into the amount she's able to spend. And it's led some analysts to suggest that Reeves may be forced to impose austerity measures in order to balance the books. The news was even worse earlier today. That's because the pound dropped to its lowest value in 14 months in response to the concerns about the country's finances. Now, there's been a lot of explanations for the sudden dip in our economic fortunes. Some have referred to global jitters over an incoming Trump presidency. Others have blamed our flatlining economic growth alongside inflation that seems to be stuck around the 2.5% mark above the government's arbitrary target of 2%. And others have detected something altogether more intentional in the market's behaviour. This was friend of the show Gary Stevenson on Twitter. Just posting, since it seems not to really be covered on the news and some followers might not have seen it. The markets are really going for the UK today, and they will probably force the government into spending cuts, possibly as soon as today. Now, luckily, as I said before, we have an economist with us who, hopefully can help make this all make sense. James, make this all make sense. Which of those explanations do you find the most convincing?
Well, sadly, it's a bit of everything. I mean, Gary's kind of right on this, but I'll come back to that. It's worth saying that although this probably hasn't got quite the attention it deserves, this is an incredibly serious moment for the government. The wheels are quite close to coming off its economic plan, and with its economic plan, the kind of wider setting for whatever Starmer planned to do once he arrived in office. So the first bit is that, look, across the developed world, the sort of big economies, typically the US and UK especially, actually, have seen the borrowing costs of government increase. That reflects partly a sort of worry in the markets internationally about what is Donald Trump going to do, which has a sort of backwash effect on everybody else, particularly the UK. It's kind of associated with the US quite closely out of every other country out there. It also reflects the fact that inflation isn't coming down as much as was expected by the mainstream. I mean, followers of macrodose will know that I've been deeply suspicious about claims that inflation will come down. Climate change is one of the things driving up prices in general and keeping inflation high. If you keep having wildfires, for example, it's kind of expensive, right? So prices are going to stay high, inflation's going to stay high. But there are specific things about Britain. One is that it's just had really quite low growth for a very long period of time. Two is that it had a government now that's done a bunch of things that don't necessarily do very much to improve that prospect for growth. I know that Rachel Reeves and Starmer talk up how they're going to have magic growth from here on in, and this is going to turn everything around. Actually, a bunch of stuff they've done just hasn't really added up to making that happen. The increase in employer costs for employing people, the national insurance contribution increase that they put in the budget last year. I mean, you can see why they did it. They're trying to raise a bit of money from the thing, but the net effect is that if you're running a small business in particular, it's more expensive to employ people. So you don't. So there's less money out there. So you have this impact on the growth that they claim to want to see. So what's happened is that financial markets, people trading bonds in financial markets, are looking at these stack of things that are taking place in and around Britain, what the government's doing, and actually not unreasonably, and as Gary has pointed out, saying, look, we don't think the government's plans into the future are entirely adding up to a stable situation where government debt starts to come down and everything's stable and happy in the way that we bond traders would like to see. We think there's some serious risks around what the economy is doing. And that is the pressure that's now landing on Rachel Reeves to either break her fiscal rules, which she said, and the Treasury has said in particular, that there is no way they're going to do this. That's understandable, because if you did that, that does start to look like a bit of a Liz Truss kind of situation. You're just throwing everything out. And anybody in the financial market will go, okay, this government has sort of lost control. So it's obvious they're not going to do that. Having told everyone they're important, fiscal rules are now really important. They're stuck with it. So it's either tax rises. Well, she's already said she doesn't want to increase taxes on big corporations, won't increase taxes on the wealthy, won't do any of these things. Political decisions, but they've ruled them out. That leaves spending cuts. In addition to the austerity that they've scheduled basically from 2026 onwards, they might try and find some more spending cuts, maybe at the spring statement coming up in March, push them off into the future somewhere and hope this kind of makes everything look okay for the markets. It's really not good. There's a few other bits and pieces she could do. She could try and rearrange the relationship between the Treasury and the Bank of England, stop the Treasury underwriting the Bank of England's notional losses on its quantitative easing program. This gets a bit technical, but there's some billions of pounds you can get out of this. There's a few bits and bobs she can do, and she may well have to. But this is a serious moment for this government, because its plan was predicated on growth that isn't now happening and isn't likely to happen in the way they want in the future, has landed a whole load of political decisions that they took because they ruled out taxing the rich. So they ended up taxing a whole load of small businesses instead. And that's turning into a bit of a disaster economically because it's a drag on demand. And this is really, to a large extent, the Starmer-Reeves programme is kind of running into a bit of a brick wall. Now, it's hard to see how they get out of that without doing something fairly significant. Maybe inflation eases off a bit over the next few months. Maybe everyone calms down a bit once everyone being in the financial markets calms down a bit once Donald Trump is actually, sitting in the White House properly. Maybe things don't look so bad. But right now, this is a serious moment for the government economically.
And obviously, they're going to use it as an excuse to say, well, when we made the commitment to this spending, conditions were different. And so now we have to roll back on the one thing that actually people really wanted from a Labour government, alongside actually taxing the rich. But even then, the forecasts for growth that they were saying that these policies could materialize were completely unreasonable. Even the best case realistic scenarios for growth were not actually going to get Britain out of the slump that it was in. That's something that, you will know in more detail if you listen to James's podcast, Macrodose, which kind of covers these economic issues on a weekly basis. We might be upset that the British economy is in the doldrums, but that feeling is not shared by everyone. In fact, there's one person who's taking our rocky financial fortunes not as a bleak sign of what may be to come, but as a personal vindication. 10-second Prime Minister Liz Truss has sent current Prime Minister Keir Starmer a legal letter ordering him to stop saying she crashed the economy. In the letter, Truss's lawyers wrote this: "We are writing in relation to statements you have made publicly in respect of our client, which have caused and will likely continue to cause serious harm to her reputation. Of particular concern are the false and defamatory public statements you made about our client in the lead up to the UK general election from late May 2024, at a time when you knew or ought to have known that those statements were false and the statements were likely to materially impact public opinion of our client while she was standing as the parliamentary candidate for the Conservative Party of South West Norfolk." Now, I thought that Liz Truss was a free speech warrior. I thought she hated lefty lawyers shutting down people's right to say whatever they want. Now, Truss hasn't just sent Starmer a letter, she's also, to our immense joy, put out a video as well.
Rachel Reeves has pushed this country to the brink of economic crisis through high taxes, high regulation, and disastrous net zero policies. When I tried to fix these problems back in 2022, I was undermined by the economic establishment, and I was forced to reverse the policies before they were even implemented. I was blamed for the LDI crisis, which the Bank of England has subsequently admitted was their fault. So let's look at the facts. Rachel Reeves borrowed far more in her budget than we did in 2022, but with no plans to pay it back through increased economic growth. Government gilt rates for both 10-year and 30-year, are higher now than they were back in 2022. Yet at the time, I was smeared by the Labour Party and by members of my own party for having crashed the economy.
For that kind of charisma, who needs facts? Well, we at Novara Media do. So let's have a look at a different version of that graph Truss flashed in her video, which shows change in UK government borrowing costs. So the blue line shows the market reaction to Truss's mini budget. As you can see, the yield was low, but began to rise over the course of the Tory leadership contest. Then in the days before and after the mini budget, it shot up pretty steeply. That pattern is different for Reeves. Before her budget, the yield was already high, an inheritance from the Tories. And yes, it has climbed, but quite slowly. There's no comparing the market shock of the Truss mini budget to the much slower loss of investor nerve that we're seeing under Reeves. Now, obviously, Liz Truss will still find it, she still finds it very upsetting that the only thing she'll be remembered for is her economic incompetence. But don't worry, Liz, it's not the only thing. Half the country also thinks of you as someone who has less stamina than a lettuce. And there's always this as well.
What I was saying a bit about incumbents, I think the average American is not doing well. And people do vote on, I think it was Bill Clinton's advisor who said it's the economy's stupid. So I think that he will probably win.
On that.
I've got a load of Trump questions, by the way. But what?
No idea where that's come from.
I remember after that, I think she tweeted being like, that wasn't funny. And I'm like, oh, Liz, once again, you're so wrong. It's really, really funny. James, you were talking about how, Rachel Reeves has to stick by her rules because if she doesn't, it will just cause a Truss-like shock. Truss thinks that she's been vindicated by the latest economic news out of Britain. Would you agree? I presume not, but what's your take on this?
Well, look, if you say that the British economy doesn't work, and this is a large part due to sort of institutional failings, and if you say, like Liz Truss, that those institutions enacted a kind of revenge on her for trying to do something about it, now I think what she did was completely sort of misguided in its own way. She's kind of got a point, right? There are like deep underlying problems here, which frankly neither her nor Rachel Reeves have a good handle on how to fix, right? Because part of fixing those problems means dealing with things like the Treasury and the Bank of England and the wider setting for financial services industry and how British businesses operate and a whole load of really fundamental stuff that Rachel Reeves especially isn't actually going to address at all. She's run away from any serious efforts to reform the financial system, for instance. She's not going to tax the rich. She's not going to do a whole load of things that are serious changes to the economy. Liz Truss, for all nonsense that she does talk, frankly, did at least say that, right, we're going to do something fundamental and try and change that. And if she also says, and I think this is her argument, that, if you're going to say, I crash the economy because interest rates have gone up, well, Labour did create a bit of a problem for itself if it's in charge and interest rates go up, because you can just turn around as Liz Truss and say, well, you're doing exactly the same thing as me. And that is kind of the situation it got themselves into. I think Labour's created a whole load of problems for itself. I think it was probably a mistake to overtalk Liz Truss. I can see why they did it in the short run at the time. It's an obvious political thing to go for. Look at the Tories, look at the interest rates, look at how much you're paying your mortgage, that sort of thing. Too easy, too obvious, but it creates a problem for you when you get in charge and the same basic underlying issues in the British economy are all there, and now you have to deal with them, and it's coming to bite you on the bum, and that's what's now happening. So I wouldn't say I'm particularly sympathetic to Liz Truss. I mean, she's quite a sort of comic character, as the clip showed by this point, but she kind of has a point, and Labour should have been a bit more careful in the past about going a bit too hard and saying, oh, she crashed the economy, we're going to sort everything else out. Well, you're not going to do that if you don't have a plan to sort things out. Where is that plan? Doesn't appear to exist.
Yeah, I think that speaks to an overall problem that Labour had both when it was campaigning but also when it was in opposition, which is that it never wanted to go for the systemic issues. It never wanted to acknowledge or speak to the fact that the problems that Britain is facing right now are problems that have actually been a really long time in the making. You know, we can trace it back to 2008. We can trace it back further than that. We can trace it back to, you know, the 1970s with the advent of neoliberalism, with the financialization of the economy. And, you know, looking on the horizon with the kind of systemic risks that are posed by climate breakdown, there was a real moment where we needed a Labour Party that was going to go for those kind of systemic changes and to really say, we need to rewire this thing because it's no longer fit for purpose if it ever really was fit for purpose. But the Starmer's Labour always made a very, very conscious effort to make this about cosmetic issues with the Conservative Party, to win on the basis of not we're offering a fundamentally different economic and political package to the Conservative Party, but rather that the Conservative Party of today, you know, lacks decorum or, you know, it lacks competence. And we're going to abide by the same kinds of principles or keep trying to do the same kind of thing, but we're just going to do it whilst wearing, you know, a nicer suit with more, you know, a more brushed out hair look and kind of like make it all a bit more cosmetically competent. And that is, I think, as you said, James, the kind of corner that Labour have backed themselves into, because by that measure, because they have said the problems with Britain are not systemic, they're not, you know, deep rooted, they're just cosmetic issues with people in the Conservative Party, with personal failings of Conservative Party politicians, then when you get in and, you know, you are still embroiled in those systemic political failures and economic failures, then you have no one to turn to but yourself. So yeah, that's something that I think also we on Novara kind of critiqued quite a lot in Starmer's Labour over the past few years. Trump's senior director for counterterrorism has called upon the UK to allow British ISIS members currently trapped abroad to return home. Sebastian Gorka, a far-right commentator who now sits at the heart of the US government, said that Britain must repatriate citizens who joined the extremist group if it wants to remain a key US ally. Now, the most well-known of these cases is that of Shamima Begum, who joined ISIS a decade ago when she was 15 and has since had her citizenship revoked. This is a shift from the position taken by the Biden administration, which stated that Britain did have a moral responsibility to repatriate ISIS recruits, but did not indicate that this would in any way impact diplomatic relationships. Speaking to the Times, however, Gorka said this: "Any nation which wishes to be a serious ally and friend of the most powerful nation in the world should act in a fashion that reflects that serious commitment to the fight against ISIS. That is doubly so for the UK, which has a very special place in President Trump's heart, and we would all wish to see the special relationship fully re-established." So the commitment that Gorka mentions there refers to the idea that those who have committed crimes abroad should be brought back to face accountability by the criminal justice system. It also refers to the position amongst some security officials that people like Begum pose less of a risk if monitored and potentially imprisoned in the UK than if she remains in detention camps in Syria and therefore outside of British jurisdiction. So this position is the one taken by the US, which has a policy of repatriating and trying US citizens who join groups like ISIS, whereas Britain has, in some cases, revoked the citizenship of those who have or are eligible to apply for citizenship elsewhere. This policy has left as many as 20 British women, 40 children, and 10 men in camps currently controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this security-based argument is categorically different to the one being made by human rights organizations like the UN, who believe those like Begum, who was a minor when she left to join ISIS, were potentially victims of trafficking. The UN has also expressed concern that the revocation of Shamima Begum's citizenship, despite being born in Britain, and rendering her effectively stateless, violates international law and could therefore lead to a two-tier justice system in which those who have non-British heritage face radically different consequences for committing crimes than those who do not. Responding to Gawker's comments, Foreign Secretary David Lammy said this on Good Morning Britain.
Something that you're willing to consider to bring back ISIS terrorists to the UK because here we can keep them safe?
Well, Ed, we in the Foreign Office and Yvette Cooper in the Home Office will always put British security interests first and the safeguarding of our population. Shamima Begum will not be coming back to the UK. It's gone right through the courts. She's not a UK national. We will not be bringing her back to the UK. We're really clear about that. We will act in our security interests, and many of those in those camps are dangerous, are radicals. Some of them, if they were to come back to prison, would have to be, frankly, jailed as soon as they arrived. I'm looking forward to discussing these issues with our US counterparts. In fact, I'll be discussing this issue with Antony Blinken later on today in Rome and at the weekend in Riyadh with the group of nations supporting Syria particularly. So it's a hot issue, and of course, I'm right in the middle of it.
Lammy there, doubling down on the position of stripping British citizenship from those like Shamima Begum. Now, it is interesting that this conversation is happening now because grooming has been in the news quite a bit recently. We don't know what exactly happened in Shamima Begum's case and in the case of dozens of other men, women, and children who traveled to fight in ISIS. And we do know from some reports that what Begum witnessed and potentially participated in was shockingly violent and deplorable. But we also know that these extremist organizations are notoriously predatory with very sophisticated recruitment strategies that target vulnerable people. And that Begum was just 15 when she was convinced by a much older man to travel to Syria and marry him. In every other circumstance, we by default would not consider a 15-year-old girl to be capable of consenting to marry anyone, even if she appeared to be fully aware of what she was doing. As the UN have commented, there is a credible suspicion that Miss Begum was recruited, transferred, and then harbored for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Under international law, consent or voluntariness or use of force, deception, or coercion is irrelevant where the victim of trafficking is a child. The obligation to investigate credible evidence of child trafficking is essential to ensure accountability for this heinous crime and serious human rights violations. Implementing these obligations requires action and the courage to listen when judicial bodies make findings indicating a credible suspicion of child trafficking. The circumstances under which young people like Shamima Begum crossed several national borders into a war zone under the instruction of a man she believed loved her have never been properly investigated, even though it carries clear hallmarks of human trafficking. Instead, she became the poster child for a policy that could lead to millions of people in this country who have any non-British heritage, who are, of course, disproportionately black and brown, becoming second-class citizens. Because for those people, we now have legal precedent that means if they commit a particular kind of crime, or potentially in the future any crime, they won't face the same justice system that white British people face. They won't just be treated as a citizen who committed or is suspected of committing a crime and therefore face the proceedings that are associated with that crime. Instead, they can be classified as a national security threat and therefore, an inherent outsider and stripped of their citizenship, even if it renders them stateless. And of course, if you're stateless, you have no access to any legal protection or basic services, and you're at severe risk of further exploitation. Because remember, Begum is not even a dual citizen. Her parents have Bangladeshi citizenship, but she doesn't. And Bangladesh made very clear that they would not grant her citizenship if she applied. So it's very easy to hear alleged stories of Begum sewing bombs into suicide vests and watching over the decapitation of hostages and feeling intense moral outrage. But it's also important to not allow that outrage to lead to the government gutting the citizenship rights of millions of, let's face it, largely non-white people, rights which are therefore a very good reason. James, I'm interested to know what you make of this intervention from Trump's administration, particularly the idea that he pushed it further by saying that not repatriating British ISIS fighters could harm the special relationship.
Well, look, I think Dalia, what you just said on this was very well put in terms of like the wider consequences of this decision, which is a pretty grubby one at best. I mean, you're basically saying, "Oh, there's this issue we don't want to deal with, so we've shoved it off somewhere else," which is all these fighters, however they arrived in Syria, they're all there now, so we can wash our hands of the whole thing. That's just the sort of one level of failure in this. The deeper failure is exactly as you say. This is setting up something that starts to look like a two-tier citizenship process, a two-tier criminal justice system. It is, as even Jacob Rees-Mogg said, I think correctly, that this is basically looks like a racist decision. These are the consequences that fall out of this. Gorka's intervention takes place, and you have to see a pattern here with what the Trump administration is doing, which is kind of clearing as much space as possible to negotiate with everyone once Trump is in office. I mean, that's what it looks like. That you make a hell of a noise now in order to sort of give yourself the maximum freedom of maneuver with everybody later on. So you threaten huge tariffs on China or Canada and Mexico. You say you're going to invade Greenland. You throw all this stuff out because what you want is everybody else on edge so that you're in a better negotiating position somewhere down the line. I think that is where this is coming from. If you start to detect a logic behind what the would-be or soon-to-be Trump administration is doing, that they have this transactional approach, they have this negotiation approach permanently to dealing with the rest of the world, and it's a part of that. So it's looking for leverage and using something that Gorka, I'm sure, realises can act as a bit of a pot-stirring thing back in Britain, and particularly this issue raised at this time for this government. That, I think, is what's going on here. Cynical, of course. I wouldn't trust anybody's motives on the Trump side as far as you could throw them, frankly, but that's what it looks like.
I believe that Trump calls that the art of the deal. Just nuke the entire boundaries and parameters of the situation so that you can get what you want. Fortunately, it seems like it kind of worked for him. Now he's president of the US for the second time. Mick Lynch has announced he will be retiring as General Secretary of the RMT at the age of 63. Lynch joined the union in 1993 after he started working for Eurostar and was elected as General Secretary in 2021 after serving as Assistant General Secretary and on the National Executive Committee. In a statement from the RMT, Mick Lynch said this on his decision to step down. "It has been a privilege to serve this union for over 30 years in all its capacities, but now it is time for change. The union has been through a lot of struggles in recent years, and I believe that it has only made it stronger despite all the odds. There has never been a more urgent need for a strong union for all transport and energy workers of all grades. But we can only maintain and build a robust organisation for these workers if there is renewal and change. We can all be proud that our union stood up against the wholesale attacks on the rail industry by the previous Tory government, and the union defeated them. RMT will always need a new generation of workers to take up the fight for its members and for a fairer society for all, and I'm immensely proud to have been part of that struggle." During his tenure as General Secretary, Lynch became one of the most prominent voices challenging the Boris Johnson government for not just the issue of rail strikes, but on behalf of all working class people. He rallied against increasing energy bills, he argued for all workers to have inflation-proof wage increases, and advocated for a ban on arms sales to Israel. Alongside leading a strike wave which secured a wage increase of 14% for the lowest paid rail workers, his no-nonsense, fiery media appearances felt to many like a breath of fresh air. To discuss Lynch's tenure and what the future might hold for the RMT, I spoke earlier to Novara Media's very own Labour movement correspondent, Polly Smythe. I began by asking her to give us an overview of Lynch's time in the RMT.
So Mick Lynch was elected as RMT General Secretary in 2021. And the fact that I love about Lynch is that he very nearly didn't end up in the railways. In fact, his route into the railways came about because he was blacklisted illegally for union activity when he was working in construction. And because he couldn't get a job back in 1993, found work on the Eurostar, and the rest is history. So when he was elected as General Secretary of the RMT back in 2021, he was replacing Mick Cash, who left. And he's had a very busy few years. The top line, the thing that we might think of first is overseeing the first national UK railway strike since 1989. But there's lots of other things that have been going on as well. The RMT represented some of the sacked ferry workers in the P&O scandal that happened back in 2022. There's been the campaign to fight against ticket office closures at train stations. There's also been, work on the underground, organising tube drivers, and then a slightly lesser known campaign that the RMT does, which is organising outsourced workers, cleaners who work for a number of companies like Serco or ISS, who work on the trains.
What made him so successful, not just as a union organizer, but also as a broader political figure that many of us have come to know him as?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, we've just spoken a little bit about the work that he did, as RMT General Secretary, but it doesn't really make any sense to praise him, specifically, just on the industrial platform. It was about how much more he gave to the movement. I think there are a few things you can pick out. I think one is his absolute refusal to operate within the boundaries set by the sort of boundaries of acceptability set by the establishment. And that was clearest when you saw his open disdain with dealing with the stupidity of the questions put to him by people like Kay Burley, people like Richard Madeley. Telling Richard Madeley he was talking twaddle, telling Kay Burley she'd gone off into the land of the surreal. He was really happy to call that stuff out. And only when you saw him calling it out did you realise, quite how infrequently that actually happens. But, I think another thing is that people really respected his principled stance, both in terms of when he was talking about workers, he was really explicit about broadening out the disputes, not just talking about pay and conditions, but linking it to much wider things. So when he said this is about railway workers deserving more pay, he didn't just stop there, and he said because actually why should the working class be poor? And we've been made poor by the government, we've been made poor by train operating companies. And I think that was really refreshing because it's a full political analysis that actually really helps people understand exactly how the situation's come to be. And that principled stance didn't just stop when he was talking about pay and conditions. He was very vocal across a whole swathe of things. He's been vocal in his support for Palestine. Back in last year when there was the outbreak of far-right violence, he urged RMT branches to get in touch with local mosques to offer support. And I think people really respect that. He's been able to cohere, the trade union movement with lots of other kinds of movements. My job is to speak to workers. I go to picket lines up and down the country, and his name is, I can hardly think of a picket line where his name isn't mentioned. Even amongst friends of mine who, maybe work in hospitality, who aren't unionized or like have quite poor trade union literacy. People really cling to him. Often when I tell people what I do, I say, I'm an industrial correspondent. They say, oh, what the hell's that? I'll say, oh, Mick Lynch. And they'll go, oh, yeah, I love Mick Lynch. So I think he really became a shorthand for the strikes, and also just for the fact that the economic model that we are working under is completely broken.
Yeah, he kind of became synonymous with not just the particular conditions for rail workers, but also the fight back in general. And I think you're completely right to identify that, he didn't allow himself to be boxed in as someone who can only talk about the particular workplace struggles of the people that he is representing, but he actually took the fact that he is, an elected member, he has the backing of this workforce behind him to actually speak more holistically about our economic system and how it's screwing so many people over, not just the specific sectors that he is representing. So given that kind of more holistic position that he has publicly, I know that you can't look into a crystal ball and you probably haven't had this discussion with Mick Lynch himself, but what would you like to see next from him now that he has kind of closed his tenure at the RMT?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that Mick Lynch probably himself is slightly baffled by, his cult status, because I've heard him say, and I've read, him saying before, there are lots of people who could do my job. And that's because the job that he's doing is just speaking on behalf of his members. So that gives him that authority, that democracy, the union democracy, enables him to speak with such clarity. So what would I like for Mick Lynch? I think a long and happy retirement. I think the job of being a general secretary, having seen it up close in my work, it seems very stressful. And I think he deserves a long and happy retirement.
Spoken like a true Labour movement correspondent there. So going back to the RMT, what is the legacy that Lynch has left behind, and what, from your understanding, are the priorities now for workers in the energy and transport sector?
So what's coming next specifically is that Mick Lynch will be in place till the end of May, and then there'll be a leadership election for the post of General Secretary. So that's the kind of timeline for that. But speaking more broadly in terms of what comes next for the union, so the RMT is currently facing a really different industrial climate to the one that Mick Lynch did, and that's because we've got a Labour government, and Labour have pledged to renationalise much of the railway system. And so whoever comes in after Lynch will, have a big task to be keeping Labour's feet to the fire on that. Louise Hay, who was Transport Secretary, I know worked closely with the RMT, and she's no longer in the post. And so, they're going to be keeping a really close eye on making sure that there's absolutely no backtracking on that pledge. But, besides that, there's absolutely loads of work that needs doing. Lynch might leave, but, the day-to-day work of the union goes on, whether that's, continuing to fight on behalf of outsourced workers, obviously the underground, the situation there, and sort of negotiating with TfL and Sadiq Khan. So I think that whoever comes in after Lynch is going to have their work absolutely cut out. But in terms of his broader legacy, I really don't think we can understate how important he was in sort of 2022 onwards, and I think that for many people he will always be synonymous with the sort of so-called hot strike summer.
That was Novara's Labour movement correspondent Polly Smythe speaking to me earlier today. Now, many of us, whilst we do wish Mick Lynch a peaceful and, restful retirement, we are going to miss his special brand of holding politicians and the media accountable. So for old time's sake, we're going to leave you with a selection of some of Mick's greatest hits.
The government is saying that they are going to bring in agency workers. My question to you is, I'm guessing that some of your members will still stay on the picket lines. What will they do if agency workers try to cross those picket lines?
Well, we will picket them. What do you think we'll do? We run a picket line and we'll ask them not to go to work.
Mick Lynch has previously said he would not negotiate with the Tory government. The head of the, you've said that. The head of the, let me finish the point. Hang on, let me finish the point. The head of the rail delivery group this morning on the Today programme said that he didn't want the government in the negotiation. We've made money available to the railway industry. It's up to the employers to negotiate with the trade unions. And what happened this afternoon was halfway through these negotiations, while they were ongoing, the unions came out onto the street and gave an impromptu press conference, I mean, there's TV footage, saying that the strike was going to continue.
OK, let's just pause. Hang on.
I mean, it's on video.
Now, Mick Lynch, excuse me. Mick Lynch, I want to ask you a question.
You think this is a class struggle, class war?
Well, there's a class aspect to everything in the economy. There are lower paid people and there are wealthy people in this society. And what's wrong in this society is that there is an imbalance between the people that do the work to keep this country going, who create the wealth of our civilization and don't get a fair share of that wealth because it's going to people who are vastly wealthy.
It's really nice seeing someone comment on the news who, and I'm not one of these people, but who actually has like the legitimacy of a workforce behind them, who actually has like credibility to be there. And it gives you a kind of like so much of that. Obviously, like he's a really talented orator, he's a really talented speaker, he's a talented organizer, but so much of that power comes from his legitimacy. And we just don't see that. We don't see enough of union organizers commenting on the news, even though they are the people who are directly dealing with consequences on the ground for working class people. But anyway, thank you so much, James, for joining me. It's lovely to have you.
No problem at all. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you everyone at home for watching this evening. Make sure you come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.